Before speaking about the last concentration camp on British soil, it's as well to bear in mind just what we mean by a concentration camp. A concentration camp is simply an establishment where civilians are held indefinitely, without trial, not for what they have done, but rather for who they are. For instance, they might be detained because they are communists or Jews, or because they are Republicans, or perhaps Jehovah's Witnesses. Not all concentration camps are places where people are starved or mistreated. The essential point is simply that civilians are detained here and never brought to trial or even charged with anything. In the last British concentration camp, men were held for years without being brought before a court, and the whole process was entirely legal. In the late 1960s, the electoral system in Northern Ireland was grotesquely unfair to the Catholic minority. For one thing, there were property qualifications for voting in local elections, something which favoured Protestants, who were more likely to be homeowners. Even worse, there was plural voting. Those who owned businesses were entitled to extra votes. All of which helped ensure that the more wealthy Protestant community remained in power. In 1967, an organisation called the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association was founded, and this group soon began to organise marches and protests with a view to ensuring that there was indeed one man, one vote in the province. For the next 2 years, things grew increasingly tense in Northern Ireland, with the hardline Protestant government reluctant to relinquish any of the power which they had held since the setting up of the province in 1921. Then, in 1969, events began spiralling out of control. In March and April, there were bomb attacks on power stations and waterworks. Also in April, there was serious rioting in the Bogside district of Londonderry. 1 or 2 people died as a result of these disturbances. The police response to marches and demonstrations was often to attack those taking part, almost invariably Catholics, and disperse them with baton charges. Behind the scenes, preparations were being made for the most momentous intervention by government in London into the affairs of Northern Ireland for many years. On the 2nd of August 1969, there were more riots in Belfast, and the RUC found they were barely able to control the violence, which was threatening to spread across the whole city. The next day, 60 soldiers were dispatched to Belfast, where they were accommodated in a police barracks. Some troops were also moved to Londonderry. It was becoming increasingly obvious that the regular police, even supported by the Special Constabulary, the notorious B Specials, would not be able to cope much longer. As the marching season began, the violence on the streets escalated, with protests and counter-protests taking place throughout August. From the 13th of August to the 15th, 1969, the so-called Battle of the Bogside raged in Londonderry, with Catholics and Protestants battling for control of the streets. On the afternoon of 14th of August 1969, the first British soldiers appeared on the streets of Northern Ireland. Their role was essentially to separate the warring factions in Londonderry and prevent the violence from escalating. At first, they did their best to remain neutral, but as matters deteriorated, the army took the offensive against those whom they felt to be the chief source of the unrest in the province, the Provisional IRA. They began to go on the offensive in summer of 1970. On 3rd of July that year, a number of raids were made in Catholic areas with the intention to seek out IRA arms dumps. This was around the Fort Road area of Belfast. In one sense, the operation was a great success because a total of 30 rifles, 52 pistols and 24 shotguns were seized. Unfortunately, while breaking down doors and searching people's homes, a good deal of damage was done, and local residents began a protest which swiftly turned into a riot. At first, large amounts of CS gas were fired at the crowds, but when this failed to do the trick, the army declared a curfew which was maintained for 36 hours. Anybody venturing out of their house was promptly arrested. It need hardly be said that none of this exactly endeared the British troops to the Catholic residents of Belfast, and it proved in fact to be the biggest recruiting boost that the IRA had yet received since the Troubles had begun the previous year. Things deteriorated throughout 1970, and by the beginning of 1971 it was apparent that some dramatic action might be needed to put an end to the mounting violence and disorder in the province. It was now 18 months since the army had first been deployed, and so far every new development saw a deterioration in the situation. There appeared to be two main options, neither of which was especially attractive, but one of which was thought to be considerably worse than the other. The first possibility would be to use the army in an aggressive role, in effect waging war against the IRA and using any methods possible to destroy the terrorist group. This had the potential to turn into a catastrophic public relations disaster for Britain, and there was little appetite in London for this particular course of action. The second option was one being eagerly pushed by the Protestant leaders of Northern Ireland. Previous outbreaks of IRA activity had been nipped in the bud by the judicious use of internment without trial, as provided for in the Special Powers Act. Surely it was now time to give this a try. The British government in Westminster was very dubious about the idea of locking people up without trial indefinitely in concentration camps. Not so much for ethical or moral reasons, but because it was doubted that this would actually stem the rising tide of violence. However, Edward Heath eventually gave permission, and a date was fixed when the army would be given the order to seize IRA suspects. One obstacle which presented itself in 1971 was that there was simply not enough room in the prisons of Northern Ireland for hundreds of extra prisoners. Northern Ireland had at that time one of the lowest rates of imprisonment in the whole of Europe. There were only 700 prisoners in the whole of the province, and since the initial planning being made was to arrest around 400 suspects, this would have increased the number of prison places needed by over 50%. The solution which was found was neat and utterly disastrous for Britain's image abroad. About 15 kilometres from Belfast, not far from the town of Lisburn, was during the Second World War an RAF base called Long Kesh. Although of some importance during the war, the 360-acre site had been more or less disused since 1945. What Long Kesh did have, though, was a stout perimeter fence and also rows of corrugated iron Nissen huts, which had formerly been used as barracks for the RAF personnel from the base. It seemingly escaped the notice of those laying plans for the use of internment without trial that Long Kesh looked like nothing so much as a concentration camp, which was, of course, precisely what it would become. Long Kesh was not the only site chosen for imprisoning the dissidents and terrorists whom the army would shortly be rounding up. In an uncomfortable echo of the prison hulks which featured in Dickens' novel Great Expectations, a former submarine depot ship of the Royal Navy, HMS Maidstone, was moored in Belfast and used as a prison ship. At 4:30 a.m. on 9th of August 1971, the army went into action, lifting, as they put it, 342 men from across the province. Somehow word had leaked out about the projected raids, and quite a few of those for whom the troops were searching had time to slip across the border into the Irish Republic. The lists which had been prepared by the politicians and police in Northern Ireland were hopelessly out of date, and a number of those detained had no involvement with the IRA and hadn't been connected with it since the 1939 bombing campaign before the Second World War. That this was the case may be seen by looking at the aftermath of the raids. Of the 342 men arrested, a third, 116 men, were released within 48 hours. The army showed themselves considerably more prescient about the situation in Northern Ireland than did the politicians who had lived there all their lives. Just as many senior officers had predicted, the use of the Special Powers Act in this way caused a huge and immediate surge in violence. In the 4 months before the introduction of internment, 4 soldiers and 4 civilians had died throughout the province. And this was a level of violence which was thought to be severe enough to call for the suspension of habeas corpus. In the 4 months following the arrest on 9th of August, 30 soldiers, 11 police officers, and no fewer than 73 civilians were killed. Rather than damping down the crisis in Northern Ireland, the use of detention without trial had the effect of throwing petrol on a smouldering fire. There was systematic torture of the prisoners held by the British, but that is perhaps better dealt with in a separate video. The sight of the British Army running a concentration camp was not an edifying one, and it caused huge uproar throughout Europe. It looked absolutely terrible, a barbed wire perimeter fence with people kept in bloody Second World War listeners. When Labour came back into power in 1974, they were determined to put an end to internment and close down Long Kesh. But it wasn't until December the 5th, 1975, that the last of these men were released. Memory fades slowly, and a lot of younger people in this country have no idea at all that there was within living memory a concentration camp in this country.